On today's show, we are covering the entrepreneurial mindset. That is about integrating the analytical and creative parts of our mind to see, in the words of our guest, our inventions blossom. Joining us here in the studio is Dr. Richard Cahoon, who is adjunct professor at the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences in the Department of Global Development at Cornell. Dick, great to have you back in the studio. It's been 6 years.
Has it been that long?
Yeah, I'm a little bit older.
Really delightful to be back. Thanks, Chris.
Lovely to have you. Professor Cahoon is also faculty author of the eCornell certificate program called Invention and Intellectual Property Management. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is covered much more thoroughly and densely in his online courses. So we'll share the URL for those of you that are interested in learning more about what we're going to be speaking about today. A couple notes to our viewers. While this discussion is primarily for those of you that work with inventors, like Dick told me, and not necessarily for inventors, I suspect, Dick, that a lot of what we cover today could also benefit inventors. Like our title is The Entrepreneurial Mindset. I imagine that drew a number of entrepreneurs, and I'm certain a good deal of what we talk about can apply universally across all these disciplines, yeah?
Absolutely. No question about it, Chris, because there is one thing that I would say practically 99% of all inventors want is to see their inventions turned into reality. And that's a lot of what this is about.
Good. Before we dig into mindset, Dick, however, I think our viewers should understand a little bit about who you are, what you do. You were director of Cornell's Technology Transfer Office for 20 years, and now you do work with the U.S. Departments of Commerce and State, also a United Nations agency. Tell us about your work because, like I told you before the show, technology transfer was actually something I didn't know about before having met you 6 years ago.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about it either until, I guess, the mid-'90s. Basically, tech transfer is that process that's now really been woven into a lot of universities' missions. And what it is capturing inventions made by faculty and staff and even students, and capturing them with intellectual property, typically patents. So that provides a handy mechanism for partnering with the private sector to realize that invention being turned into something, a new product, a new service, a new company even. So it's something that was started. Most people look to 1980 when the process got going with the change of a national law called the Bayh-Dole Act. And now every university in the U.S. pretty much is engaged in it. And more around the world, we're seeing people really realizing that this is something that they should tap into for the benefit of their society.
So what does the work look like itself, right? So, for example, right, you just traveled to Kyrgyzstan, right?
And
what were you doing there?
Well, so first of all, we're trying to create an infrastructure to build this innovation system, which is built mostly on their public sector research institutions, mostly their universities. So we're getting their leadership on board with the idea that this is something that they should embrace, and setting up a system, some policy and practice. But then you start working with inventors. And when I first started working internationally, one of the questions I had, I knew the answer, but the question was, are there inventors in various parts of the world? And I'm here to tell you that there are inventors everywhere, maybe not Antarctica, but just about everywhere in the world, you'll find inventors.
So inventors included, why do you think mindset is so critical to being a successful entrepreneur, intrapreneur, innovator?
Yeah, well, I've been doing this for now almost 45 years. I am an inventor. I have a patent in my name and an entrepreneur. And really decades of the evolution of my thinking and observation, not only of myself, but also of colleagues and people that I've mentored and many inventors at Cornell and elsewhere. And, it's something that now I almost take for granted that the difference between pretty good and great is this attitude, is the attributes of thinking that people bring to an activity. It isn't so much the actual skill or knowledge that's important and essential, but it's that extra soft skills, some people call it, or these attitudes that whenever I see somebody who's really an achiever or doing really great work, I realize that it's because they exhibit these mindset attributes.
I see you light up when we talk about creativity and its role within this. There's a misconception that creativity sort of ends with the act of invention. You submit otherwise. You say that's actually a jumping off point for further creative opportunities. Tell me what you're talking about here.
Well, I remember reading years ago about the statistics of patents and how few of them were ever realized into something, new product or service or a company, that most inventions kind of wither on the vine. And
why?
Well, it's because, and I've been doing this now for decades, where I work with inventors and inventions to take them from the point at which the inventor says, okay, I've invented, to take it from that point and then move it through the phases of validation, of thinking about where it fits in the world. What is the invention anyway? That is a really creative process. And the more and more that I've done it over the years, I can now point to many inventions where I say, the invention that I was handed by the inventor is almost nothing like what we ended up with.
We're solving a whole new problem sometimes.
Totally new problem. I frequently get inventors look at me and go, I'd never really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
And we've brought in a new application, a new attribute, a whole new approach oftentimes. Yeah.
You had mentioned in our early conversations a couple days ago about this dynamic that takes place. Quite often you're working with engineers, technical people that are devising technical solutions to a problem that demands a solution. And in that, there's not a lot of right brain thinking. You know what I mean? So if we're talking about that creative impulse, maybe you bring that to the process of invention and commercializing something.
I think that and this is part of the fact that I've been doing this for so long, that I began to realize that there was this level of creativity that I probably wasn't tapping into enough, or that I could tap into more. And I realized that many of the inventors, as you say, that I've worked with over the years, scientists and engineers, really strong in the left brain, analytical, linear, systematic. And I love that. And that's, essential. But it's that creative side that in this world of invention, where you need all that analytical, linear, but boy, it's that creative side that really causes things to, as I say, bloom. And so when I realized that was something that I needed to stimulate in myself, and a lot of good things came from that I was trying to be more balanced of both hemispheres of my mind, then I started to teach that more. And so I do now in my classes, and I work with inventors to try to stimulate them to maybe stimulate more of their creative side of their thinking.
So let me tell you, you tell me how you get this done, whether it's in the private sector, governmental type of thing, or even in a classroom with your students. What is the case that you're making for this mindset? Maybe you can get a little bit more into what it actually is, right? So how do you approach this with your students?
Well, one of the first things I always I ask them about it, do they understand the left brain and the right brain, and that there are these different ways of thinking, and some are aware of it and many aren't. But one of the things that pops up pretty quickly is this idea of actually thinking about your thinking. The psychologists call it metacognition, which is this ability to understand how you think and to step back from your own thinking and go, oh, I can see my analytical proclivities here, and that maybe my creativity side, maybe it's not as developed. And so with my students, I'll say, okay, let's talk about your creative side. And most of the students that I get in my course are technical. based science and engineering. So I'll ask them, well, do you have anybody play music? Does anybody like music? Anybody paint? Does anybody do sculpture? Does anybody do things?
Generative creation.
More
stuff.
creation, just thinking outside the box, that sort of thing. So that stimulates a lot of dialogue and thinking.
Sure, right. So people can bring whatever they've learned from. I mean, music is maybe the greatest, right?
I guess in a lot of ways, it's sort of the classic, no pun intended, of that creativity. But I see it now in a lot of different ways. In fact, now I'm working on a new course. I was asked to develop a new course called Design and Invention, which is to look at functionality of inventions. That's where I spend most of my time, about things that work better, they're faster, harder, and bring in this aesthetic, like when something looks beautiful, that's new too. And how do those interact? And so that's going to be a new course that we're going to be embarking on next year.
So you've been doing this for decades. Did you learn anything about mindset? Did you have anything that guided the way that you've ended up here? Who did you learn from?
No, so it's been just a self-discovery process. I didn't understand any of this. It just happened as I was interested in doing things. So I was always doing, learning. And so through experience, I developed, through trial and error. I would say the first step for me was I took a course after I got my undergraduate degree. I took a course in efficient reading, which actually did teach me how to read faster, but it did something else. It taught me how to learn, and it taught me how to think about my thinking. And that was really the launch of my brain can work in different ways. And so I started to think about it. And these days, I think about my mind like I think about a fine instrument. Mm-hmm. I think of it like a Stradivarius, like it's a beautiful thing. It's the tool we use. What can I do to tune it? What can I do to get the best music out of it?
Sure. Hopefully the climate control works in here for your
it's so far, my mind seems to be working fine.
The wood is not warping quite yet. So let's get into some of the more tactile type things, right? So when you talk about inventiveness and when an invention when it blossoms, once you give it the proper mindset. Tell me about this concept, inventiveness analysis. What is this process? This is something that's part of your courses, by the way.
It is.
You can teach this.
I can teach that. In fact, I have a tool. In the course, we actually have a tool that I developed called the inventiveness analysis tool. It's something that patent lawyers are familiar with in terms of understanding what part of an invention is patentable.
Yeah.
So to be an invention, it has to be something created. It has to be beyond just an idea. It has to be something that's been elaborated in some form, usually writing or in some kind of visual way.
The prototype? Are we even pre-prototype
or
at
even
this point?
pre-prototype. It could just be data.
Yeah.
A lot of inventions, of course, are molecular, so it's data primarily. But the first step is to go, well, what is the invention? And it sounds simple, but just describing the invention, when you work with an inventor and say, well, let's describe it, they oftentimes don't describe it very well. And oftentimes, the more technically dense, the less capable inventors are of describing it well. Sometimes they'll describe it with too many words, and sometimes with the wrong words or with acronyms and so on. So you have to define exactly what it is, and then you do what we call a prior art search, which is you look for. See, an invention to be inventive has to be completely unique. Mm-hmm. And that means you've got to search the databases of the world in patents and technical literature to see if it is in fact unique. And when you dive into these features of an invention and compare it to the prior art, things start to happen. You realize that the invention, maybe parts of it aren't unique because the prior art has already shown that. And that means it's not inventive. But then you find there are things that, yes, in fact, are unique, but the invention as originally thought of by the inventor begins to evolve because the prior art kind of configures it. So
Yeah.
you get this changing. Now, the other thing that will happen, and this is something that inventors really appreciate when someone like me comes in. I'm not an inventor, and I never pretend to be the inventor. I wouldn't barge in like that. I'm there to help them. But I'll say, for example, your invention, you invented it to solve this problem in foods, but I don't understand why it couldn't be useful in paints. And they go, oh, I never thought of that. So what happens is what I call lateral inventiveness, where an invention made by an inventor to solve one problem, you realize, oh, it could be applied over here. So that's one of the areas of expansion that can happen through this inventiveness analysis.
Post-it
process.
notes was an example where
Post-it notes
wasn't supposed to be about a post-it note.
Yeah.
What happened there?
The Post-it note actually was a failed, I have one here just to remind me of such things.
Okay.
The Post-it note was it was invented at 3M by a chemist who was trying to come up with a new adhesive. And he actually met the fellow at one point. He failed because it doesn't stick very well.
Yeah.
And therein lies yet another form of creativity, which is the failure of an invention in one way turns out to be a positive in a different application.
That's right.
Yeah.
It sticks just enough, doesn't leave residue when you take it off.
In a lot of ways, it's beautiful. But, if you were searching for a really permanent and good adhesive, this is a failure. But that's where you've got to step back and use that right side of your brain to go, oh, but wait a minute. Maybe those other attributes aren't a failure in another application. That's the level of creativity that I'm talking about that never ceases to amaze me, how much value we as non-inventors, but inventor enablers or helpers can provide.
So tell me if inventiveness analysis works for just the same in intrapreneurial endeavors. Tell me a little bit about how this may apply to those entrepreneurs in our audience who may not be inventing a patentable brand new thing.
Well, so this process of, first of all, using both sides of your brain on a problem, every entrepreneur, you have a problem that you're trying to solve. The problem is usually how do you bring a product or service to the market? And so you're trying to solve a problem. How do you do it? Almost always you've got limited resources. Now, intrapreneurs are within companies. They're like entrepreneurs. They're trying to do the same thing where they're taking a new thing, presuming they have an invention. Both the entrepreneur and the intrapreneur will have an invention, and they're asking the question, how do I take it from where it is now to a preferred outcome, the start of the company, the sale of a product, the sale of a service. So the problem solving, and this is probably where it doesn't really matter. A lot of the things that I've learned over the years are applicable in many different fields. Yeah. And there's a set of things that I continually have to remind myself about mindset that I think are really good prescriptions for ultimate success in this entrepreneurial domain. So, for example, and I say this to myself all the time, and this is something that I have to tell my students frequently, especially younger folks with a lot of energy and analytical thinkers, is don't analyze too soon. Don't jump to conclusions. And I've been guilty of doing that. I want to just leap to a decision right away. I want to leap to an answer. It's satisfying. And yet something happens that isn't optimal when you do that. You want to just, the way I think of it is, you don't try to solve a problem initially, just live with it.
Yeah.
Just live with it for a while.
Yeah. Another concept I want you to tell me about. You had mentioned this concept of intellectual lenses. How does that compare to what we have just been talking about? What are you getting at with intellectual lenses?
So I realize, and this is again the benefit of a lot of experiences working with hundreds if not thousands of inventions and inventors, and my own startup and so on. And that is, over time, you realize that you're using the same thought process over and over and over. And so maybe what you ought to do is develop a tool or a template or some way that you ultimately learn helps you understand, helps you get insight. So it hit me one day when I realized that, of course, like any lens, when you have a lens like this type, you don't see so well. And when you put the lens on, suddenly everything becomes clear. And so I realized that there were certain things that I was using, certain tools, certain approaches that had this intellectual lens effect, which is if you use them, then things become clear. So the inventiveness analysis tool is one. Right. That's one where if you take any invention and you plug it in there, it's a lens that tells you something about this invention. Another one that I really like is in this domain of implementation and commercialization of new technology is the value proposition. That's a term that entrepreneurs like to use and investors use, which is what are the value proposition is the benefits minus the cost. Very simple. Yeah. But forcing yourself to describe that is this lens that really makes everything get very clear.
This was something that I was kind of wondering about. Mindset can't be that beneficial if it exists in a vacuum, right? You've got, maybe it does just serve the individual, and that's how this whole thing kind of works. But how does my mindset figure into a team type of thing, especially when we're inventing something? We've got a small group together,
right?
How do you get everybody dialed into a mindset?
Good question.
Should you?
Good question, because it's not a straightforward answer. I mean, any invention that I've ever been involved in that has become successful is successful because there are partners, there's teams, there's interactive collaboration. The inventor's working with the entrepreneur, who's working with the investors, who's working with the marketing people. All those participants need to work together in a collaborative way. I think, first of all, it's important that the individual entrepreneur, tech manager, invention manager have a certain set of inherent personal attributes, the mindset of themselves. Like, for example, you got to keep your ego in check, right? This is, and if you keep your ego in check, you don't get unraveled when people critique your work, for example, or they tell you that you're wrong. You need to work on things like your own resilience, your own emotional intelligence, your own optimism. There's certain things that I believe that we can focus on in ourselves that make us a good team member. And then beyond that, it's like, yes, you've got to respect other people. You've really got to appreciate the fact that you need others. And you got to respect their opinions and enjoy the process of collaboration and also some people call it even the intellectual friction, because that happens. And so you want to be ready for that and enjoy the process. I also am a big believer in, you and I were talking about this earlier, the sense of humor. I think, to me, one of the reasons that I've been successful is that I have a sense of humor and I know when and how to use it. And it's an extremely powerful tool. It makes things more enjoyable and the teamwork's better.
Yeah, speaking of the team working better, viewers have submitted some questions.
Sure.
Let's take a couple if you don't mind. I have one here from Navjot Sandhu, who asks, where can inventors, entrepreneurs get support for projects that aren't going to give venture capitalists that really large payback, but do take significant initial capital? Any advice there? That's the eternal question.
I wish I had the quick answer. It's always a good one. You have to be persistent. you have to ask for help. You have to look around and ask for help. I have always appreciated what we call angel investors. Angel investors are people who invest in entrepreneurs and inventions and inventors because it's the right thing to do, not because they think they're going to make a huge profit right away. So you got to look for those people. I think networking is probably the best thing one could do. I don't know where the questioner is, but if you in your community, I'll use an example here at Cornell in Ithaca, when we were trying to get an entrepreneurial ecosystem going and find investors. I went to the Rotary Club and made presentations, and we met a guy who was a car dealer, and he stepped up and said, well, this is very interesting. Can I help the community by being an investor? And that led to something called the Cayuga Venture Fund.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's still around.
Still around.
So always be ready with your elevator pitch. Be ready to go, right? Because you never know when you're going to turn.
Absolutely right.
Okay, because we're doing this in 2024, we have a question from Matt who asks, will AI help, or what would the impact be? I'm sure you've bumped into these conversations, AI's impact on speed and innovation and inventiveness.
Yeah.
It's got to be going on everywhere.
It is. It's popping up everywhere you turn. Of course, it's early on to know the impact that AI is going to have. I'm sure it's going to have big impacts in some areas, not so big in other areas. But I'll tell you what I've learned so far in my brush up against AI in actual hands-on kinds of projects where we're doing analysis, we're looking at inventions, we're looking at markets or what have you. And that is, when I've known a subject extremely well, but I've gone out and said, well, let's just test the AI capability here, what I get back is a mixture, and the mixture is some good, some very good, and a fair amount of junk. And that is, I just get a lot of things that you have to sift through. You still need to use a lot of judgment and thought. This is where, AI, in my mind, it doesn't replace. It just helps support good thinking. So you're still going to need humans to come here and sift through and go, that's a quality nugget. Mm-hmm. We're keeping that. And that probably makes it all worthwhile. But sure, a lot of it you're going to just have to ignore. So I'm kind of excited to see how it applies in various areas, and I'm certainly open-minded. I would just say we should never rest on our laurels as human beings. We should continue to show up and use our best thinking and judgment.
What other attributes serve us well when I'm thinking about inventiveness analysis? Yeah. That's learning how to do a thing, but also viewing things through intellectual lenses, creativity, curiosity, open-mindedness. What are some of the other things that you teach, like within your courses?
Sure.
Other attributes that would benefit our viewers?
Yeah. Well, I would say, and I should probably take the time some point to try to prioritize these, because I suppose some of them are a little more critical than others. But I will say the first one that pops into my mind is, and this all is involved with right brain, left brain, and problem solving and being creative and yet analytical at the same time. And that is connecting the dots. Now, we talk a lot about connecting the dots, right? And I encourage my students to connect the dots. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, so you're looking for relationships, you're looking for patterns, and when you start getting pretty good at that, and you'll make some connections that make no sense, but that's okay, because you learn over time that sometimes you have to make connections that in hindsight turn out not to be great, but they also led you somewhere. But here's the thing about connecting the dots. Before you can connect the dots, you have to collect the dots. So this is one of the things I tell my students. Look, you can't just connect dots until you start to have the dots. And so that means you go out there and you kind of live with the problem. You gather information. You're open-minded to serendipity. Serendipity is that just happenstance. You weren't even expecting it. That's one of the nice things about working in this field of invention, where thinking outside the box can come in very, very handy. And so you allow your mind to be open-minded to another thing I would say is there's a big role for your subconscious. And that's why one of the reasons I say, don't try to analyze things too heavily initially. Just put things in there, put information in. Don't try to solve it. Don't try to come up with a solution. Just put it in your consciousness. Your subconscious or higher conscious, whatever terms you want to use, will generate solutions for you. And for me, they come out when I'm not even expecting it, when I'm running in the morning.
Yeah. Just gotta be
when
ready.
I'm cooking.
Yeah, you got to be ready to go.
I'm chopping the carrot, and all of a sudden, I get that inspiration.
It's the best, isn't it?
I love it, yeah.
Dick's reading list. You've recommended a few books to us. A Whole New Mind by Daniel Pink. What's that about? Why would our viewers read this?
I think that's a good one to give a little more context about this. The idea that if you can rely upon both hemispheres, if you can look at your own thinking and go, gosh, I'm really heavy on the creative side. Maybe I could develop a little bit on the analytical side. How do you do that? And he's got some techniques for stimulating that balance. That's a good one. And then I really like this Power of Mindfulness. It is one of the things that I rely upon. I did say earlier that this is this fine instrument. I consider it like a Stradivarius, and I take care of my instrument, and that means I do a little meditation. And this book on mindfulness was given to me in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. It's short, but it's got some really great advice in terms of how to treat your mind in terms of the way you. I like concentration and free-flowing thinking. So these are some of the ways to tune your mind so that you're really ready to go when you get a real problem that you're going to try to solve, like turning an invention into something real.
What about Carol Dweck's mindset? What's that one about?
That's, I think now a lot more people are aware of Dweck's work, a psychologist who studied success, in people. And one of the take-homes for her, and she writes about it, is this idea of the growth mindset. And the growth mindset as opposed to the fixed mindset. The growth mindset says, and I like this quote, I use it in my class, and I say that the fixed mindset says, well, I can't do that. Whereas the growth mindset says, I wonder how I'm going to do that. So you fight the fear of failure. You don't mind mistake. You are willing to try things. You understand that evolution of your thinking is preferred over perfectionism. Someone once said perfectionism is the enemy of the possible. Yeah. And these are some of the things that I think you have to keep in your mind as you are, and this applies to any field really, maybe not brain surgery. You probably should be pretty good at that when you dive into someone's brain. But for the most part, in most endeavors, I think to being willing to do things and fail and make some mistakes is part of the pathway.
Hey, I want to talk about a particular tactical or strategic juncture in the process. Bria asks, this is a good question. When do you know that you've figured out your target audience or your niche for your innovation? Is that something you should continually revisit? I don't know. Help us through that one. But
the target audience.
How do you validate your assumptions, your customer discovery kind of stuff, coming up with user profiles, et cetera?
Well, so that's an interesting question.
Is that beyond the scope of your purview?
Well, gosh, I'm always challenging myself to, and in this world of invention, and there are so many different types of inventions that I've worked on, and that means different marketplaces, different kinds of technologies. What pops into my head right now is just to say I try always to challenge my own thinking and never be in a cocoon. And I'm always telling people, look, you might think this is where you got to control your ego. You may think you know the answers. You may think you know your customers. No, you got to get out and talk to people.
Yeah.
And more, I'm finding, gosh, I probably didn't listen enough in my earlier years. In fact, maybe last month I wasn't really listening enough. I need to listen more.
Yeah.
Need to listen more. That's a really good skill.
Maybe one other thing too is to go where the data takes you, right? So what do you know about your existing customers? We are awash in data. It's got to be able to help you out.
Sure. I mean, I'm a big lover of data, and I love science and engineering. I rely upon it heavily, certainly. But that said, I also, this is where, having a little bit of stepping back and looking at big picture and understanding what the data really says, and just getting out there and talking to people. I can't overstate the importance of, and I see this a lot with inventors, especially in universities. We see people talk about reality like they know it really well, and yet you ask them, well, have you ever talked to somebody who flies a plane? Well, no, but I can assume what they know.
I know how to make the most comfortable pilot seat.
Let's go talk to them.
Yeah, sure.
You're almost always surprised by some things that you didn't know.
Okay, another dynamic here. Somaz asks, how can we create the right way to stay on the path of innovation? Sometimes we lose momentum, maybe after the invention's been created. You must bump up against this all the time. You lose the will to go on. You're doing things the wrong way, your assumptions, whatever.
Yeah.
Any advice for this kind of thing? How to sustain momentum when there's no forward progress?
And that is a good question, Somaz. I'll tell you what I've certainly have done over the years is that I think you need to know when to set things aside, for one thing. You put so much energy into something and it doesn't come out the way you expect. And that's another thing too, is that my life has been a process of trying really hard for certain goals, and some of them have come to fruition and some haven't. Yep. And that is the hard reality that some things you're just going to have to look at. My first company failed. And I'm glad it did, because if it hadn't failed, I wouldn't have gone in the path. So sometimes when you lose momentum, I think it's time to maybe set it aside for a little bit, change your thinking. I really rely upon changing my thinking by it can be as simple as taking a hike or taking a few days off, getting your mind off of it. Go think differently about, just to get away from that for a while before you come back to it.
Couple questions, tough to choose, but I'm going to pick one from Asan here, who asks, in what ways can an inventor's mindset around collaboration and open-mindedness? I think what Asan's getting at is getting more people involved in your innovation or your invention. Can it actually dilute the quality or the originality of the idea? Is this a dynamic that you see?
That I see?
Groupthink.
I would say, I probably wouldn't put it as dilution.
That was my word.
Okay. I would say, can you get distracted? Can multiple voices, we say too many cooks in the kitchen.
That's exactly what the question is.
That absolutely can happen.
Yeah,
and
sure.
And I think this is one of the challenges for an entrepreneur in particular, because entrepreneurs will come up with there's an invention over here in this department, and they bring it to the process, and then invariably there are people who, for whatever reason, are negative
Yeah,
and
right.
negativity is a common theme within organizations. And for whatever reason, in fact, I've had companies ask me, CEOs of companies, would you please analyze our company and tell me how we can be more innovative? And I have to come back to them and go, you need to hire different people. Either that or the people there need to really be retrained in terms of the way they think. So, yes, you absolutely can go into team efforts that are going to do nothing but derail. That is true.
I'm going to take Asan's other question because I think it's nice. What are some common mental blocks or limiting beliefs that can hinder the inventive process? Maybe common pitfalls that we all experience as human beings.
Yeah.
What do you see?
Well, fear, fear, anxiety, fear of being wrong, fear of failure, fear of looking silly. One of the things that now I take for granted is that when I work with inventors, and it's easy now because I look like a professor and, like I've got enough years behind me. But when I was younger, I would go and talk to world-class scientists, and there's that tendency to think, oh well, gosh, I'm afraid to look like an amateur, and now I just don't have that at all. I delight in going into situations and go, I don't know anything about this. Teach me, and so I think that's one of the pitfalls, is that we're afraid to look silly or not smart enough, so that's one. As I said, that's where I think our ego gets. But on the other hand, people will. You need to have a certain level of self-confidence, and I think compassion. I've learned over the years, the older I get, the more compassionate I feel for people, for organizations, the planet, et cetera. And part of the compassion should be directed to yourself. You should say, hey, I'm not perfect, but hey, that's great. And so enjoy life. And that's also where I think, have a little sense of humor, even laugh at yourself a little bit.
You have to.
You have to.
Somebody that can't laugh at themselves, what kind of dinner guest are they going to turn out to be?
Exactly.
Okay, couple of notifications here. So earlier on, Dick, you had mentioned a couple tools that we can use, available to anybody. Google Patent, U.S. Patent Resources.
Yeah.
We dropped the URLs in the chat here. Any comments or notes on how we can use these resources smartly without wasting a bunch of time or spinning our wheels?
Well, so those tools are essential for doing what we call prior art search. Prior art is that necessary task that we have to search for patents. Like Google Patents is great because it's worldwide and it's free. And you need to find those patents that are as similar to the invention that you're analyzing, and that's when the process really gets started. So it's free, but it involves searching databases, and I'm no specialist in it, and I don't claim to be. So I'm always open-minded to find people who can help me. Librarians. Librarians, Whether they're in the public library or in a university library, look for librarians and ask them for help. They're happy to help you, right? And they'll say, sure, let's sit down and do a search. And so those are some free and available resources that I'd recommend.
Good. So in addition to mindset and everything that we've covered today, can you tell me a little bit more about what the student in your invention and IP management certificate program will learn? So everybody that's here, knowing everything they've just learned, where will that set of courses take them?
So it's the certificate program. The full program is 6 modules, and it goes in a logical, sequential way from initially having an invention, analyzing it, separating out inventions from just ideas. And again, it's designed for those who are inventors themselves, but also people who are helping inventors, whether that's in a company or in a university. So it starts with looking at inventiveness, and then it moves into you start thinking about markets and business and this value proposition lens I talk
Sure.
about, and then you start addressing other issues about things like the things that make the difference between success and failure, like scale up. A lot of inventions, you get them and you go, this is great, but you can't get it out of the lab because it can't be turned into something that could be manufactured and brought to reality. And then it goes through all the way to where you're actually managing this process in a company or in a university and using the different tools that I've mentioned.
Perfect. Viewers, today's episode will be a podcast next week. I think we're going to publish it next Tuesday morning. If you haven't checked out our podcast, please do so. They're released every Tuesday. We cover everything that comes out of Cornell University. So I look forward to you connecting with us there. We'll shoot up the QR code for our podcast. Dick Cahoon, great to have you in the studio today.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Tons of fun.
Pleasure.